Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's May edition of the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. Very happy to have everyone who's able to join us this evening, and for anyone who's joining us from the recording, happy to have you as well. So for anyone not familiar with our community, this meetup was founded to act as both to help with professional development, networking, and learning for folks interested in Microsoft 365 and its applications within the government and public sector space. We have a few pretty basic community standards that we'd like to call everyone's attention to. Please be respectful and considerate to other members. Please do not share any information that you're not authorized to share in a public forum. And certainly we encourage and allow folks to self-promote or market their offerings, but we definitely ask that folks keep it reasonable and non-excessive. And just a reminder that while many of us may work for Microsoft, other companies, or government entities, we're all here in our personal capacities and don't reflect the official views of our any organizations we may be associated with. I would like to thank Andrew Kagan and Andy Oak from Planet Technologies, who are my co-organizers for these meetups. Without them, these meetups would not be possible, so huge thanks to both of them. For anyone who does not know me, I'm Nick Giard. I'm a program manager with the Office 365 engineering team, and certainly passionate about Microsoft 365 and its applications within the government space. For anyone who has not used Teams before, we generally have these sessions just to avoid kind of unscheduled interruptions. We normally have them somewhat moderated, but we really encourage and want participation and engagement. So feel free to use the chat or raise your hand, and we'd be happy to kind of enable it so that you can unmute and ask any questions or participate. We want to be very collaborative, but we just want to make good use of the tools within a public internet forum. So appreciate everybody's patience there and certainly encourage everyone to participate. I do want to call everyone's attention to the upcoming 365 EduCon, June 12th through 16th. There's a lot of this is an excellent event, and there's some tracks and information really tailored to government scenarios with Microsoft 365 and other related technologies. So certainly wanted to make sure anyone who wasn't aware of this is tracking, and if you're able to, would love to see you attend. It's not directly associated with our meetup, but another great community and learning session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Richard Wakeman, who is the Chief Architect for Aerospace and Defense with Microsoft. And Richard has some amazing content around Microsoft's collaboration framework and kind of collaborating cross-cloud between worldwide, GCC, GCC High, and other scenarios. So I know this is a topic of great interest to many folks. And Richard, we're very happy to have you here tonight. So feel free to introduce yourself and take it away. Thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you for having me. This is I always love these meetup events. Great opportunity for us to share information. And I would encourage everyone here as well. Definitely don't be shy. I mean, this is intended to be more of an interactive type venue. So, as we go through some of the content, if you have questions right away, or of course, as we delve into the architectures, I can imagine that you'll have further interest in ultimately how to achieve those in terms of looking at adoption of sovereign cloud. So let me pop up here into my presentation, and there we go. So I've been working with Microsoft 365 government clouds since they were introduced. My history goes back, to the very first cloud service offerings that we hosted, Live at EDU and BPOS, and start to date myself a bit there, but as we were looking at the big blockers that ultimately would impact many of our government customers or highly regulated industry customers, often had to do with compliance and security. And as we introduced, for example, Azure Government to meet many of the stringent compliance requirements, especially working with the military, U.S. Department of Defense, up to a high watermark of compliance with IL5, right? That it also gave us an opportunity to begin to introduce these same clouds and capabilities to our our customers within the defense industrial base and also within research institutions such as FFRDCs and UARCs, et cetera. But they had to live by the same rules ultimately, which is that collaboration, especially with Microsoft 365 GCC High, was rather limited and by design in many cases, given that things like the DoD network was highly restricted in terms of who could connect to it. But we heard really early on that ultimately there were valid use cases for being able to not only do sharing internally within your organization, but also externally and to cross many different boundaries and firewalls bidirectionally, for example, between the DoD environment, GCC High, even on the lower side with commercial and GCC that's paired with commercial. So what we did is really took a step back for a moment to say, okay, we have these highly regulated industries, especially with the defense industrial base, in which case, they need to be able to get their work done, right? They have valid concerns that a standard commercial entity would have. And then, of course, working with DoD and other federal agencies, especially cabinet level agencies that have requirements for the GCC High environment, that we took in a number of different use cases to really define what it is that we're trying to solve. And that's where we introduced the collaboration framework. So the collaboration framework, if you think of it as different rings, it can be described as varying different levels of trust. Now, I will caveat this in saying that you don't always trust, for example, all of your internal people at the same level. Oftentimes, you will have groups of users within your tenant, in which case you would have varying different levels of trust. But generally speaking, if you are for example, the legal entity that is managing or operates a company or government agency or whatever, that you'll have the highest level of trust within that organization or application of policy and so forth. And from the very beginning, we've always encouraged our organizations, if at all possible, to deploy into a single standard tenant, right? So that would be a tenant that would be for the entire user population of your organization or entity or agency, in which case you have the highest level of collaboration that's possible. You also have the highest level of being able to configure policies that you manage and that you can enforce on your user populations. So this first ring of trust is saying, hey, it's a standard type organization. They can go into a single tenant, but they still do need to have, for example, collaboration that would be more of a B2B nature, right? Business to business. It would be with external parties that are outside your organization. And we'll generally refer to that as like the ad hoc organization collaboration. As we introduced our Office 365 productivity suite, this goes all the way back to the first iterations of, for example, SharePoint Online. There were capabilities of being able to do ad hoc collaboration. In many cases, it may be just sharing a document or document library that generate a URL. And as people want to go access that specific resource, it may challenge them for authentication. In most cases, it would be something called OTP or one-time passcode, right? But we've had that around, since over a decade since the first introduction of Office 365. Now it has evolved to have much richer capabilities today for ad hoc collaboration, and that would include our full B2B capabilities. And of course, with Azure Active Directory, we've got a number of different capabilities to enforce policies for external sharing. A little bit more on that to come. But let's get into the second ring. So if we look at and build out to the second ring, this would be the complex org. Of course, I was gifted with one of the best customers on the planet back 2007. One of the first ones we had to try and look at accommodating a large Department of Education, in this case, Kentucky, where we had 189 school districts, and that ultimately mapped to a very complex organization, right? And since then, I'd say the vast majority of customers I've worked with are complex orgs. It would be defined as the same legal entity, but has and manages multiple tenants. Now, they could all be in the same cloud, which was the case with, for example, the Kentucky Department of Education, or for most of my defense industrial based customers, they're going to straddle clouds. So that would include having, for example, the US user population within a US sovereign cloud, Microsoft 365, GCC High, Azure government, as well as, for global presence that you may have a separate tenant that is in commercial or some combination. But at the end of the day, you do own all of the tenants in this complex org scenario, in which case you can synchronize policies across those tenants. And of course, you would to maintain administrative control, in which case you would say, maybe it's not the level of granularity that you could do with a standard org, a single tenant, but it is still a higher level of trust than you would see typically with true external sharing. So that's the complex org with many tenants. Now, as we start to extend out from here, we added this third ring was actually in collaboration with National Defense ISAC and some of the other working groups that we engage with, and saying that, there's actually a legacy way of doing external sharing that most organizations have adopted in some extent over the course of time, what you would call an extranet, right? So an extranet would be typically a set of curated accounts that are sponsored by the organization that owns the tenant. So what does that mean? That means that somebody in your company is going and creating new user accounts and assigning them to external users, but where if they need to authenticate or get their password reset or any of these other administrative tasks, the organization is going to need to own those extranet accounts. So we call those sponsored IDs. They're still widely in use, although they're beginning to transition more to a B2B model that is a modern authentication approach as compared to the extranet. Now, the fourth ring would be trusted partners. We oftentimes refer to trusted partners as being like an MOU or a memorandum of understanding that you would have between two different organizations, in which case you would be able to have a standardized set of policies that work for both organizations to meet their compliance requirements. So imagine, a defense industrial based company could be like a Lockheed Martin, and they've got a subcontractor that builds the motors for their planes, like Pratt & Whitney over at Raytheon Technologies, in which case they may set up a trusted partner relationship between their two organizations, and they both know that they meet that high water mark for compliance, especially around device management. So you can set up essentially a trust between two tenants, and it could be bidirectional. And I'll get into a bit of the details around how that's implemented here in the next coming slides. Now, I don't want to just completely overlook the ad hoc collaboration, however, because even those that operate in, let's just say, GCC High and Azure Gov, and they have very high watermark for compliance requirements, doesn't mean that they still can't have a tremendous amount of value that would come from ad hoc collaboration, right? In cases where, for example, you may be collaborating on content that's not highly regulated, even though it's in a highly regulated tenant. So many of my customers still do have valid use cases for enabling that fifth ring. They just have to make sure that they guard and have the right data protection policies in place to ensure that you don't get unintentional spillage by enabling that ad hoc collaboration. So let's talk about how we took these multiple layers of collaboration framework, and we're able to now apply some technology to it that really gave us now a much, I would say, facilitated way of establishing trust or federation, if you will, between multiple tenants. And that's where we introduce the cross-tenant access settings. The cross-tenant access settings is something that has to be set up in both partner tenants, right? So you'd set it up in tenant A so that it sets up a trust with tenant B and vice versa. And then you have some control settings. One of those control settings is to say, hey, I'm going to trust your multi-factor authentication, which is like wickedly awesome for a lot of my customers that have tons of partners, subcontractors, suppliers that they work with. Just simply managing multi-factor authentication at every single tenant is really untenable. So the ability to have a single source for multi-factor authentication in the user's home tenant as they go to visit other tenants, whether they're owned by the same organization, such as a complex org, or they're going out trusted partners, you can trust that MFA now in such a manner that they would only be prompted for MFA one time and only have to register their devices in one tenant. It's a great addition as compared to the capabilities we had of B2B in the past. The other is compliant devices, right? In this whole world of zero trust architectures, now we've introduced this ability to define not only identity and authentication at the user level. Are you a person that has been entitled with access to some resource in a traditional permissions model? Now you can say, okay, well, if you're going to access controlled unclassified information in my tenant, you're going to have to come in with a device that is compliant itself to be able to store, process, or transmit CUI, in which case there's a conditional access policy that you would have in your tenant that would restrict only compliant devices to connect. In that particular case, it can be trusted from the source tenant. Before we had cross-tenant access settings, any of those conditional access policies were ultimately broken for external use. Now with CTAS, you can have both multi-factor authentication and the device attestation as well. And we're adding new capabilities as we speak, such as being able to do levels of assurance. That would be, for example, for MFA, forcing maybe an oath token or a FIDO2 key or RSA or other ways that you can be able to ensure that not only do you have multi-factor, but maybe unphishable multi-factor authentication. So let's talk a bit more about CTAS. In the case there is a way that you can allow for outbound access settings. So in this particular case, in the past, you weren't really able to either allow or block user accounts in your tenant from being able to access resources outside of your tenant. All right, so with CTAS now we have the ability, you can start to lock that down, and you can be able to define outbound access for specific users, groups, or apps so that you can get more fine-grained control over what your users are accessing, right, external to your tenant. And then from an inbound access perspective, it would include saying, okay, hey, when people access our tenant and they come in, they must be configured with CTAS. It's really common for an opt-in model, right, that we have for GCC High and Azure Gov. Customers that typically don't turn on external access, or they crawl, walk, run into external access scenarios, in which case they may say, hey, the only people that are allowed into my tenant are the ones that I explicitly set up cross-tenant access settings for. And of course, you can say, I'm going to trust MFA claims or compliant device attestation, etc. Now, if we look at the cross-cloud collaboration, this is also a setting of CTAS where you can, for example, if the tenant does cross the sovereign cloud boundary, that you can enable cross-cloud collaboration as well. So in this case, you can see that it would be able to traverse from the commercial, any one of the regions of the commercial cloud to GCC High, as well as DoD. You may notice I don't have GCC on here, and the reason for it is GCC is actually it's a region, basically a carve out of our commercial cloud offering. So in this case, it's the sovereign clouds include GCC High and it's pairing with Azure Gov and the ability to bidirectional sharing between those environments. China's a little different. Of course, doesn't make sense for us to have sovereign connectivity between China and US clouds. So those are prohibited today, but China does have collaboration down into commercial. Always like to point out, hey, this whole B2B technology is really quite simple. We've had it around in some, certain capacities since Active Directory was first established, with a resource force model, et cetera. But it really has been modernized in its implementation with Azure Active Directory because now we support so many different modern authentication models as compared to in the past. But if you look at it from just a really high level, the idea here is you've got a member user, or it would be an account that is internal to a GCC High tenant, right? And they are provisioned with a guest account, or more appropriately, I would call it an external account, because you can have an external member account as well, but it's a little bit out of the scope of this discussion. But at the end of the day, you can have an external account that is now provisioned and given entitlements or what I would refer authorization to resources in the tenant. Now, in this case, the guest user B does not authenticate in the Contoso commercial tenant. Anytime that user goes to access a resource that they've been given permission to in the resource tenant, they will be redirected back to their home tenant, right, to authenticate. And assuming that they authenticate successfully, then it'll redirect back to the resource tenant and given access to said resource. So that is B2B guest access in a nutshell. Let's talk about the O365 collaboration modalities. This is one that a lot of folks are here recently been taking a snapshot of. So we've always had classic collaboration to some extent in our US sovereign cloud. So, for example, that SharePoint Online capability to do file sharing and even co-authoring has been around for quite some time. However, it's only authenticated with one-time passcode or OTP. It's basically when you go to access the URL, it points to a document. It's going to redirect them and say, go grab this OTP code from your email, and they'll have to go check their email, and the OTP code would then be delivered so that they can authenticate through email or OTP. We've also had the ability to do Teams meetings, of course. Teams meetings now are fully aware and across cloud capacity so that you can join a Teams meeting from your rich client, whether it's on your mobile device or the Teams rich client running on Windows, etc. We've also had the ability to do federation, as you want to call it. It's old school Skype for Business or even link server tech that we've had around for quite some time that enables a jelly bean, right? So the jelly bean's that little red, yellow, green indicator that you see next to somebody's face, in which case you can start a chat, you can do a voice call, video calls, etc. And of course, that presence capability with federation has been available for quite some time, even with Teams connecting to Skype for Business server on-prem or to other Teams organizations that are hosted in Office 365, both in commercial and GCC High. And while it was on the roadmap for quite some time, calendar-free busy sharing is available and has for the last couple of years so that you can see, in Outlook what people's availability are. Could be blocks of time or even full details if you allow for it, especially with the complex org scenario. Oftentimes they'll have more details that are shared as compared to a partner organization. Now, getting into the rich collaboration, this is where we introduced the ability to do the cross-tenant access settings. And I do apologize, it's an older slide. That this full capability for Azure Active Directory to do cross-tenant access settings in support of cross-cloud is generally available. So that was made generally available back several months ago, and supports pretty much anything that you can do inside of a browser. All right, so that would include web application access. That would include web docs. So, for example, being able to do sharing through SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and using the actual Office suite through the browser. The one thing that's been lacking is still on our roadmap. It's private preview now, is the ability to do cross-cloud with Teams. And that will come in two different flavors. There is the ability to add an external user to a team group or channel that would include external guest access. That public preview is anticipated to happen in the second half of this calendar year. And we're anxiously excited about having that come online, just by virtue of the fact that it'll close the loop and really give us that panacea of having cross-cloud to support the full Office 365 experience. I mentioned there's another flavor here for Teams, and that is the ability to do authenticated meeting join. So in the case of having people cross-cloud join meetings today, they'll come in as an anonymous meeting participant, in which case, for example, they'll have to fat finger in their full name, in which case a lot of people don't really use their full name or don't have their company affiliation appropriately defined. So moving forward with authenticated meeting join cross-cloud, you'll be able to see users' details light up to include their real display name and their company affiliation or other address book attributes that you would like to have appear on the Teams meetings that are authenticated. It also can prevent anonymous users from connecting as well. Let me just stop there. There's the next section, we're going to start getting into some more of the reference architectures, but in terms of the roadmap or any of the content that I've covered thus far, is there any questions, comments, observations?
Richard, we have a question from the chat around, is cross-cloud for shared channels coming to GCC? So I would interpret that a little more broadly, just in terms of shared channels and cross-cloud in general.
Yeah, so the shared channels capability is not yet scheduled for a roadmap date. Generally speaking, we do have a goal to get to parity, but at this time we do not have a roadmap date to share with you. The Teams groups and channels is in private preview now, and will be public preview soon. So that is much more tangible than shared channels. Alrighty. So diving into reference architectures. So there are two sets of reference architectures, in which case we've had almost an equal amount of interest for most of my GCC High customers in both what I'll refer to as the complex org scenario. That's a single organization that have multiple tenants, many of which are in multiple clouds. All right, so there's the data enclave approach and the split tenant approach there for a single organization. And then we get into true B2B. That would include external sharing with true business partners, suppliers, contractors, customers even. And that would include the ability to do external sharing directly within your tenant, as well as some new, I would say, concepts that we've evolved with, such as having extranet enclaves or meet me tenants. So let's dive right in. The first thing I like to do is kind of define what I mean by an enclave, right? So a data enclave is oftentimes what most of my customers start with whenever they go into GCC High. So a data enclave may be, hey, today I'm on-prem or I'm in commercial, and I want to set up a tenant with a sole purpose of protecting, let's just say, ITAR export control data or controlled unclassified information. In which case you'll have an exclusive set of users that would access that tenant. Typically, for GCC High, it would be, that you'd have to be a screened US person to access the data enclave. And it would be configured, with a set of policies and oftentimes a very restrictive user experience so that you would prohibit, for example, exfiltration of data from the tenant and may hit that compliance set of requirements. For example, if you look at the defense industry, we've got the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, which mandates that you must meet all 110 controls of the NIST framework for 800-171. Or in the case of the upcoming cybersecurity maturity model certification, or even other federal supply chain initiatives that are starting to be introduced by Department of Energy, by critical infrastructure, et cetera, that NIST 800-171 is be very prevalent, in which case you may say, hey, I'm going to configure this whole data enclave to be at that higher watermark for compliance, especially if it's untenable for us to do so in the commercial tenant. That's also quite often referred to as a swivel seat. So whenever I mention a swivel seat, which you'll catch me on the mic doing that quite often, that's where you're saying, okay, I've got two distinct user identities, right? I've got a commercial persona that I sign into to access the commercial side, and I've got a completely separate identity that I swivel seat into, and a persona that would be aligned with typically like the federal or defense business that would be in the data enclave. That oftentimes also translates to having two different endpoints. So it's not just a swivel seat of having two different identities to sign into, it's also having two different laptops or devices or virtual desktop sessions that you would use to connect into the data enclave. It is quite often a very popular option to get to compliance very quickly, especially if you're on a timeline for a mandate or certification like a DIBCAC high certification, or in other cases where you've got a relatively small defense business or federal business and the rest of the company simply does not need that rigor that's required, that a data enclave approach may be sufficient for your organization. But as I mentioned, almost every one of my customers starts off with GCC High with a data enclave, and they would swivel seat into it. Now, there are a lot of detractors to the data enclave, most of which is that even though it may be the most secure configuration, it may be the least secure in terms of keeping your data safe if your users aren't using the environment appropriately. So oftentimes in a swivel seat scenario, you got end users, they're given a choice, they're going to always drift towards using the commercial side environment because it's less restrictive and oftentimes has better sharing capabilities, or they kind of go outside of the data enclave because it's just simply user. It may not be malicious at all, but it may just be the fact that the data enclave is so restrictive they can't get their work done. So they may end up having quite a bit of spillage into the commercial side environment. Plus, from an end user experience perspective, I don't know that I've ever come across a person that says, hey, I love this swivel seat, right? They'll oftentimes have a desire to have one device and one account that they sign into on a daily basis. So as we look at, it's almost an evolution curve, not hard and fast, but I've seen many of my customers, especially the ones that started off on GCC High back in the early days, like 5-7 years ago, that they've gone through this learning curve / evolutionary period where they say, okay, in order for us to better protect our data and to give our end users a much better user experience, we're just going to start to migrate those users that swivel seat into GCC High, in which case you become a split tenant model, right? And this is where some user population of your company would be exclusively in GCC High. The rest of the users are bifurcated into commercial, and that you are able to set up and effectively have collaboration between the two. But now you only have a single license per user, so lower costs from a licensing perspective. You'd also have better user experience because they are ultimately using a full account in one tenant as opposed to swivel seating. Now, many of the customers I work with, even some of the largest in the world, right, have decided to go all in which case they would take their entire user population, even in many cases foreign nationals or, user populations that are distributed globally, and move them all into GCC High. In which case, if you ended up with an enclave with and paired with GCC High, starts to introduce this whole concept of the Meet Me tenant or the extranet enclave. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in coming slide. One thing to point out here quickly is around shared data versus personal data. Wouldn't call it personal data. Actually, I think I've relabeled it in some white papers I've done recently. But the idea is you got shared data, which would be available to multiple people. That would be, for example, unstructured file storage on a file share. It could be a SharePoint team site, Teams group, shared calendar, be a shared mailbox, an application that's shared, etc. Those are all shared data examples, where the owner of that shared data may be a group of people or somebody designated to own that storage, versus personal data in the context of the enterprise. That would be your My Documents folder, it'd be your OneDrive for Business, your Exchange personal mailbox, your Teams account, right, that you use for scheduling meetings and for hosting group chats and chats, etc. It would be generically your SIP account, right? In all the cases of the personal data, the owner of the content is the user, right? So they can share out their document as required. And the reason why I bring up this difference between shared and personal data is you're going to see this now applied across multiple of the reference architectures that I talk about here briefly. In which case you could say, hey, like for example, if you've got an extranet Meet Me tenant, it may only be shared data, meaning that they would still continue to use their mailbox wherever it may reside, and personal data, ultimately would be in one location, whereas shared data may be distributed across multiple tenants. However, personal data also has about the highest exposure for data spillage. So, and I can't tell you how many times I've had customers, partners, and so forth have to deal with this scenario where they say, hey, we just simply don't put any regulated data in email. And that may be a great a policy, that's a human-based policy that you would have for your own organization, in which case you instruct your users not to put regulated data into email. Truth of the matter is, in this modern world and the way that you collaborate with people, is there inevitably somebody outside your organization would still send you regulated data. So if your environment where your personal data is not compliant, it is word of wisdom to say that you need to make sure that you truly don't have data spillage, right, into those personal data. So yeah, I'm gonna shoot over here to get into the reference architecture. So This is a diagram that I created. Gosh, it's like 7 years old now, and it's amazing because we've been talking about this cross cloud capability now going back even longer than that since Azure Government was released. And in the early days, we called it tenant friending. Then we call it XTAP or X tenant cross tenant capability, and now we're into cross-tenant access settings is the actual formal name for it. But it really illustrates how you're able to set up, for example, teams in SharePoint can be able to set up sharing between multiple tenants effectively. You can have calendar free busy. You can have cross-tenant access settings for applications and web flows, etc. Of course, all that can be wired up to an on-premises and a full hybrid configuration. And what's relevant here would be for, like, for example, a complex organization where they've got a U.S. defense business. In this case, would be illustrated in the red color scheme with GCC High and the U.S. Sovereign Cloud. We have a worldwide commercial tenant that also offers data residency. So that would be the ability to have data, for example, mailboxes stored in the US or UK or France or Australia, et cetera. But it's still, a challenge to put non-US data in a commercial cloud if it is tied to especially defense regulations, but export controls, ITAR, EAR, other official sensitive in the UK or Canadian controlled goods, et cetera, that still, drive folks to having the content held on premises within an in-country data center, in which case the hybrid configuration may persist for some period of time until those regulations may open up paths for being able to store, for example, export controlled data in a commercial cloud. Swivel seat, quite simple here. Oftentimes with a swivel seat, you're gonna have a full setup that would just be a standard Office 365 or Microsoft 365 configuration. In this illustration, it's showing that you got Azure AD Connect and a set of hybrid workloads such as Exchange or SharePoint or Skype for Business that are on-prem, set up in a hybrid configuration to the commercial cloud. In this case, you have got Office 365. You may have Azure for infrastructure as a service like Azure Virtual Desktop and so forth. It may be hosted in Azure Commercial. And over here, you can see on an island that there is a U.S. sovereign cloud configuration. I call that, the enclave approach, where you've got a swivel seat. And in most cases, a swivel seat, at least initially, are set up with cloud identity, in which case they may be detached from the directory that resides on-prem, or if you so need to have a full, let's just say, federal enclave that will include infrastructure also on-prem, nothing would prohibit you from doing so. It's just in this particular case, you can see there's a bespoke architecture, in which case there is one, let's just say, for your federal or defense business that would be aligned with the government or U.S. sovereign cloud, GCC High, Azure Government. And then commercial side, of course, would be fully isolated there. And you'll notice there's not specifically any collaboration set up between the two tenants because not needed. In this case, folks are swivel seating, right? They're signing into the commercial tenant with a separate set of credentials and endpoints. Then they sign up and have access to the enclave as well. So that is a swivel seat. Now, as we start, if you remember that chart that showed going left to right, where you start to migrate into the GCC High tenant, then it may be something that resembles this diagram. In this particular case, you can have one or more Active Directory forests and domains on-prem. The diagram only shows a single Windows Server Active Directory. It's traditional Active Directory domain services. It could be one domain and one forest. This could be many forests and many domains. That topology is really irrelevant in terms of implementation here, because you can have, for example, Azure AD Connect be able to source accounts from one or multiple domains and forests. But the one takeaway with this particular diagram is that your user populations are perfectly bifurcated between commercial and, in this case, the US sovereign cloud, right, GCC High. In which case, if a user synchronizes over to the commercial cloud, their primary internal account, their home account, would reside in commercial. And then for any of the users that would be destined for GCC High, they would not synchronize to commercial, and they would synchronize to GCC High. So let's just say 80-20 rule, 80% of your users synchronize to commercial. The 20% that are left over would synchronize to GCC High and nowhere else. All right, so in this case, your user population is fully bifurcated. Now, the downside to that is naturally, if you only have one account and your account is in GCC High, you're in an island where you cannot collaborate with the other 80% of your company. So this is where we can now introduce cross-tenant access settings that you see here in the middle, and allowing for cross-cloud, we call it B2B or external access between commercial and the US sovereign cloud. And that can be paired together with a technique that I refer to as a GAL sync scenario. So GAL sync identity management terms been used in the exchange communities for quite some time. And what that means, GAL is global address list. And then sync is to say, okay, for every user that has an account in, let's just say, commercial, they're going to be provisioned with an external account in the other opposing tenant. And vice versa, for every user that has an internal account in tenant B here, that they are going to be provisioned with a guest or an external account in tenant A. So every user, in this case, unless you filter it, right, every user will appear in every tenant. You can do a full mesh. There's a whole article we wrote on techniques of how to do this, so I won't go into a whole lot of depth other than to say every user can be visible in every tenant. That populates the address book. It makes the jelly bean available to everyone. It also can be used in this case for applying permissions to resources. It's pretty transparent to the end user, for better or for worse, because now folks that are in GCC High can access resources that are in their tenant ubiquitously with resources that are in the commercial tenant. Data protection policies aside, the general principle or idea behind it is that now you've got a full capability for both user populations to access both tenants at the same time. Now, for the GalSync solution, it does require to roll up your sleeves a bit and do some scripting or some identity and access management. Again, there's a whole article that we published that explained this in more depth, so I won't belabor it here. But I will hit on this, and this is around, hey, why did we have the boundary to start off with, right? People are like, if we turn around and give everybody access to everything, both the commercial and the GCC High tenant, why have the GCC High tenant? Well, there's a whole reason, the way that we manage the GCC High and Azure Gov environment, so that it meets, IL5 and export control and a bunch of other reasons. But, it still does have a perimeter that you need to protect. And in this case, you might say, okay, hey, if I am going to give somebody access to the commercial side environment, you may not just give them access. You may have additional set of policies. Really, a simple set of policies that you could do would be to have them step down through a VDI session, in which case that it would prohibit data exfiltration on that VDI session. And Nick, I do see your hand. I'm just going to finish this thought, and then we can I'll pop back to you. So I would say it's a 50-50 split with a lot of my customers. They would say, hey, I'm going to allow people to step down in the commercial, but if they're going to go access their timesheet or HR application, I'm going to give them a separate endpoint so they can't just start to spill data in the commercial. Or in the other way, there's probably even more valid scenario of saying, okay, I've got a user that's in commercial. I know that their endpoint, their desktop, their device is not compliant to access resources in my tenant. So I may have them step up through a compliant endpoint that may be Windows 365, Azure Virtual Desktop. But since you can't trust their real device or endpoint, you're going to give them a compliant endpoint to access the environment. And that's going to be especially useful for a lot of true B2B scenarios. But yeah, let me pop over to Nick. I know we've definitely exhausted our time here pretty quickly, huh?
Yeah, well, no, this has been amazing so far. So, I mean, Richard, I know we have a pretty captive audience. So if you have more content you want to cover, I'm sure folks would be happy to stick around if you have a time stop here. This has been great so far. There was one question from the chat I did want to call out.
Sure.
So the question from the chat from Matthew is, can I inherit the IAL confidence, I assume he means identity assurance level, of a home tenant if I have a tenant that someone accesses as a guest and they auth against their IDP? Thinking about NIST 853 and trying to have a FedRAMP moderate resource tenant.
Yep. So the short answer is yes. And that's a lot of the work that we've been doing here recently, especially on alignment with our the work we've done for the cybersecurity executive order that came out last year. And that's both for enforcing unphishable multi-factor authentication, levels of assurance, etc. And it does function for guest accounts. And if it's not already in preview, I've heard that capability will become effective with cross-tenant access settings as well. So the levels of assurance would carry through from the home tenant as a guest account accesses another resource. And you'd have to, of course, define the policy, like a conditional access policy in the resource tenant, to include the level of assurance. But yes, it can trust it from its home tenant.
Great. And then we have a second question from the chat from Kevin that says, Richard, are there any plans to add configurations that only allow access to web apps with no download?
Yeah, like limited access with SharePoint Online. So yes, you do have limited access for anything that has to do with document storage that's in SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online generally, even Teams that sit behind the document library sits behind Teams. So that is defined in a conditional access policy, and is, at least historically, has been referred to as limited access. I think that would be really amazing to have limited access scenarios pop up in other workloads as well. That's something that's been a discussion, especially around getting into, I would say, non-office workloads, such as Power BI and applications that you may host through Azure Active Directory.
Great, thanks. So I'll totally leave it up to you. If you want to keep going with content, I think we'd be, we have got 48 people still online, so I think you've got a captive audience. But if you're looking to wrap up, then we really appreciate the time you've given us so far.
Yeah. Let me finish up this split tenant model. And then I would offer that, I could share some of the other webinars I've done, or to come again sometime to get more into like the Meet Me tenant type reference architecture. But let me finish up some thoughts here in terms of having the split tenant model, where you've got a half of your organization that's in commercial and the other portion of your company that would be in GCC or GCC High or DoD. It gives you an opportunity now to get really a clean start in the way that you approach external access and external sharing, especially if it's your own internal user populations. There's a capability of Azure Active Directory Plan 2 that we have called entitlement management, and it is just invaluable in this scenario. So entitlement management has several things: access reviews and access packages. And just to hit it at a 300 level, it's to say, okay, if I'm going to provision you a external guest access into my tenant, I'm not just going to allow it to be ad hoc. What we're going to do is set up access packages. And as I entitle you membership to this access package, it's going to come with a bundling of permissions, right, that give you access to a group like a Microsoft 365 group or a Teams group or channel. It includes SharePoint sites, applications, and generally even security groups that define ACLs potentially all over your tenant, right? So it's pretty powerful capability. And those groups could even be tied to, for example, purview information protection sensitivity labels, which get even more interesting because then now you have the ability to give people not only access to the content from a permissions perspective, but also with the encryption that may be applied to an MPIN sensitivity label. But the key here is that you have full governance over how those users are given access to your tenant. And even more beautifully, if you remove them from the access package, it cleans everything up for you. And you can go find the stragglers through access reviews. But in the past, I can tell you this has been really a challenge before access packages were enabled, because we would have to go crawl through all of, using all the APIs of Office 365. We would have to go crawl everywhere to find where people had permissions or access to data. So using access packages is great. I see a hand up. You can come off mute or
yeah, let me add him. Matt, go ahead. You should be able to come off mute and
Yeah, Richard. I think that the importance of entitlement management usage, especially in GCC High, can't be understated. Even if you just think in kind of where I always think is mapping to mapping to a control, right? How many controls are there in TMMC or NIST 800 171 that talk about standing access or access reviews or those types of things that need to be done, and you need to have them in your SSP as to how you're doing them. This just presents a great platform for doing that in a pretty semi or almost fully automated fashion. So glad you highlighted those.
Yeah, and this is the approach that we've been taking, especially as people are really still uncomfortable about doing external sharing in GCC High. Access packages can go in either direction. In this particular scenario, it shows a GCC High user stepping down into commercial. It is a very valid scenario to have a commercial user that could access GCC High and also be gated through access packages as well. Funny, and just as a sidebar, a lot of folks, including myself, initially getting into this business, oftentimes would say you would never allow for a commercial user to access a GCC High tenant. That would just be forbidden, right? The whole point of having a US sovereign cloud. Well, the truth is actually somewhere in the middle. And much of that has to do with the fact that a lot of my customers that use GCC High have their enterprise home in GCC High and Azure Gov, which if you start wrapping your head around, it's like, hey, how do people get into their HR systems, into their enterprise resource planning, their ERP system? Maybe it could be their customer relationship management. Any of that may be hosted out of GCC High as a default. And you have two choices. You can either give commercial users access to it so they can get to their HR or timesheet or their payroll and so forth, or you have to duplicate it, right? And that's not good either. So there are absolutely valid scenarios of commercial users accessing GCC High tenant, and many of even the DIBs that we work with are homed in GCC High. And we always like to say there's a much less complexity if you can just put everybody in GCC High as opposed to having to split tenant like you see illustrated here. But just know that you are allowed to have even foreign users, non-US persons access GCC High. Microsoft does not police that. It is fully a shared scope of responsibility for compliance, in which case, if you allow for non-US persons into the tenant, then naturally you're going to want to protect your export control data effectively inside your tenant. That was just a review. Now we're getting into the extranet tenant scenarios. I'm happy to share the slides, but what I'll do is probably go ahead and wrap it up here now. And happy to do, because if we get into the external sharing scenarios, that's probably a good additional 30 minutes of content based on how verbose I've been this afternoon. So.
Yeah, Richard, and we would be happy to have you back for a follow-up session, maybe on a related or other topic. So, yeah, any closing thoughts you have? I will stop the recording, and then if there's folks who want to stick around for questions or discussion, certainly we have the space as long as we want.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this. Has been a great opportunity for us to start to really innovate. I think the future and where we're going with much of this is, especially capabilities, is to move more in a zero trust architecture by oftentimes what I'll refer to as secure by default type configuration, in which case you have a much more restrictive environment, but then you can start to be able to give and encourage collaboration with the right data protection policies in place. With that, I'll go ahead and